Welcome to A Place for Film, the IU Cinema podcast. On this week's episode, we're talking about experimental underground films. All right, hello everyone. Welcome to the show. My name is Andy Hunsucker.
And I'm Jason Thompson.
And on this week's episode, we're talking about the Underground Film Series with Mark Benedetti. All right, so let's talk about what's coming up at the local theaters and at the cinema. The first thing, now this isn't for this weekend, but a big event for us coming up the week after. We want to get the word out. We want to tell people about it. We are going to be hosting a film at the cinema.
We are.
So we're going to introduce the film, and we're going to do a live episode after it. And this film is Casablanca.
It's just a small movie.
It's a little indie thing.
Yeah.
Bogart makes an appearance.
Not quotable.
No.
At all.
Not something that you would have heard of or, would hold a special place in your heart.
No.
None of those things.
Nope.
So we are going to, it's at October 4th, Thursday, October 4th, 7 p.m. We're going to introduce the film, and after the film, we're going to do a live episode with Will Scheibel, our old pal who is a CMCL grad student. He teaches noir stuff.
Yeah.
He also has taught Casablanca several times, so he's probably, short of Jim Naramore, one of the closest things we have to a Casablanca expert around campus, at least that we have access to.
That's right.
So that's going to be a lot of fun. We want to have a lot of people there, as if you needed another reason to come to Casablanca. Like, I figure most people, if you're on the fence about Casablanca, I could understand if, your kids' play was the same night or something, but if you don't have anything to do on Thursday, October 4th, and you're like, Casablanca's probably not worth going to on the big screen, come on.
Yeah.
Come on. That is ticketed. Get your tickets now, $3. You don't have to pay to see us. You're paying for the movie. We'll take up a collection after the film.
That will help.
Yeah.
Pass around a hat.
Yes.
Mm-hmm. Keep this thing going.
But no, it'll be great. It's going to be great. A lot of fun. So big thanks to John for letting us do that. All right, so let's talk about the Underground Film Series, and to do that with me is Mark Benedetti from the Underground Film Series, one of the programmers of this series.
Hello.
So, Mark, you're also a projectionist at the cinema, correct?
That is correct.
You're still doing that. Good.
Yes.
So there's actually a whole list of people that helped out with this, and maybe you can talk about how the process of picking these films worked. Because you've got, let's see, I'll just read off the names. Okay. Laura Ivans-Hully, Natasha Ritzma, Andy Urich, Rachel Schaefer, and Joan Hawkins. So when you have that many people sort of selecting films, how do you kind of does everyone pick one film, or do you all kind of get together and agree on a set of films?
We have a meeting. Actually, there's a person missing from that list, Mark Hine, who is also part of our committee.
Okay.
We get together generally. Sometimes some semesters we'll do it via email, but in general we'll get together and throw out ideas. We usually have 6 shows per semester, so we sort of try and give each person a show, sort of negotiate things. Sometimes people don't care. Sometimes people feel very strongly about an idea that they have, so we sort of hash through it that way. It's very there's no real system to it. If someone proposes an idea that everyone else likes, then we'll say that's probably a good idea. If someone proposes something and no one else seems to care about it, then that may be less likely to get in the actual program. If somebody has an idea about fitting into a different series or bringing in a filmmaker or something like that, that'll get extra attention. So there's a lot of different things that play into it, but it does eventually end up being a kind of a group decision.
Cool. So the Underground Film Series focuses on films that are experimental or otherwise sort of out of the mainstream, otherwise underground.
Right.
And this is programmed by students and faculty in the Communication and Culture Department. I know we talked about this the last time you were here, but do you know about how long has this been going on? How long has this series been going?
If my memory serves correctly, our first series of shows was in the spring of 2004. I think that was our first one. So since then, we've been doing it every semester.
Yeah. So let's talk about some of these films. Now, we have there are some of these that have already passed that are in the program book here, but you can, not too many of them. So the first one, this is 4th week in a row, Spunkmeyer. He's back. He's not going to go away. Jan Spunkmeyer, the shorts program was billed under your banner.
Right.
But we kind of talked about this before. Spunkmeyer could kind of fit into the whole underground film series.
Absolutely. I mean, as a guy who is explicitly associated with the Czech and Slovak surrealists, he is very clearly fits into a kind of avant-garde or experimental tradition, as there was also a surrealist film tradition as well. So, yeah, definitely.
So that was on August 31st, so that one's passed. And then the other one that we're going to miss, because it actually has not happened yet as of this recording, but it will happen by the time it airs. So on Friday, September 21st, will be 2 Years at Sea, directed by Ben Rivers. And maybe you can tell me about this film and the filmmaker.
It's kind of unfortunate that we're going to miss this, because this is probably the one I'm most excited about for this semester. Ben Rivers is an English filmmaker who's been working for the past 10 or 15 years in his own kind of self-invented genre of, he's kind of an experimental documentarian, which is a term that a lot of experimental documentarians don't like because it seems sort of limiting. But his documentaries have they're not exactly documentaries because he's happy to stage things and include them as elements. In this film, it's portrayed as the sort of life of this guy who lives in the Scottish forest, kind of on his own, off the grid kind of thing, in his own self-built house, portrayed as this kind of very oddball hermit-like guy, even though in reality the guy has like a phone and a computer and stuff. So he does these sorts of pseudo-documentaries that have these other strange elements to them. One of the most interesting things about his work is he very often uses expired film stocks and hand-wound cameras, and very often does his own processing. So he processed this film in his kitchen sink. And so it gives his films a very specific, unique sort of artisanal look that you're not going to get from a lot of work, that tends to go hand in hand with the kind of odd lives that he tends to portray, as well as the very often sort of wilderness or semi-uncivilized spaces that he often portrays in his work.
Okay, so this guy, he's not just experimenting with the style of filming, he's actually experimenting with the technology being used. Yeah,
I mean, there's a long tradition in experimental filmmaking of filmmakers thinking of themselves as kind of artisans, as they do basically all the work on the production. They, very often people will manipulate the film strip as a medium. And so he sees himself as kind of in that lineage in terms of, the crew on this film. It's a feature-length film. The crew was him and a sound recordist, and that was it.
Okay.
So it's, he did all the editing. He did all of everything. And so including these elements of using unusual film stocks, hand processing the film himself rather than sending it to a lab, really links him even more closely to that artisanal tradition.
Very cool. So we've also got a set of films, sort of a whole evening of films from a guy named Derek Jarman, which I don't know anything about this guy, but you've got two sets of films here. There's his Super 8 films, which I'm guessing are short films.
Yes, they're shorts.
And then
One
Blue, which is a feature film.
Derek Jarman was a British filmmaker in the 70s and 80s. He died in 1994 from complications of AIDS. And he was an extremely important filmmaker, particularly in England, but also in the U.S., as a kind of independent filmmaker. People talk about him as being experimental or avant-garde, but there's a strong... Blue is sort of an exception to his features, as we'll talk about in a second, but there's a strong distinction between his Super 8 work and his other features. His other features tend to be narratives, very sort of strange narratives, but nonetheless narratives, typically with very gorgeous camera work. He had a certain sort of Baroque sensibility in a lot of his narratives, whereas the Super 8s are Super 8s like a lot of other experimental Super 8s. They're very personal. They tend to be very private. They tend to rely on the kind of graininess and sort of quote-unquote low-fidelity image recording that Super 8 provides.
Yeah.
So he was a very influential guy on a lot of particularly British but also American filmmakers growing up in the 70s and 80s.
Yeah. So talking about Super 8, Super 8's sort of more like a home format.
Yeah.
And is that just, you talked about how they're sort of doing it all themselves. Was this a choice forced upon them at first and now it's become sort of a stylistic choice, or has it always been kind of a stylistic choice that I want to use the cheaper stuff to kind of evoke a certain emotion?
I would say for most people, for someone like Jarman, it would have been a specific choice as opposed to forced for budgetary reasons. 8mm was as a format was invented, I believe, I don't even know when 8mm was invented, 60s maybe. maybe earlier. But I think sometime in the 60s, and a lot of experimental filmmakers in the 60s who had been used to working in 16 millimeter would do some work in 8 millimeter because 8 millimeter has this very specific look, because 8 millimeter couldn't record synchronized sound. And so they might be interested in the possibilities of not recording synchronized sound. Super 8 as a format emerged in the early 70s. One thing it could do is record synchronized sound. And for someone like Jarman, Super 8, it's specifically the characteristics of the medium. 8 millimeter and Super 8 both look different than 16 millimeter. You kind of can't make 16 millimeter look like 8 millimeter. And 8 millimeter has a certain kind of intimacy to it and a kind of personal characteristic because it has that sort of home movie look that you can't really get with even something like 16 millimeter, let alone 35.
Yeah. So what about this feature film, Blue?
Blue, it's really exciting that we're showing Blue. We actually showed it a number of years ago on VHS, and it was sort of unfortunate because it was on VHS. Blue was his final film, which he made while he was both suffering from complications from AIDS and going blind. And Blue it's about 90 minutes long, I think, and the entire image track is a blue screen. It was originally, when he was originally conceiving it, he kind of got the idea from another project that he had in mind about the painter Yves Klein. I don't know if you know Yves Klein. He was a French painter who invented his own color of blue, known as International Klein Blue, and he would include it in a lot of his work. And so that's where the blue comes from, but then he completely changed direction with what he was doing, dropped the Yves Klein aspect and just kept the blue part. And so the entire screen, image track is just a blue screen for the entire movie. Really nice, deep sort of blue. I don't know if it's actually International Klein Blue, but it's a nice blue. And the audio track is a really complicated montage of a really interesting music track, and then a few different actors, including Tilda Swinton, reading mostly passages from Jarman's journals, particularly his journals he was writing as he was going blind and as he was suffering more and more from AIDS and the effects of AIDS. And so it's sort of, sometimes it's very elegiac, sometimes it's very sort of tragic, sometimes it's really uplifting. There's a lot of little stories sort of interspersed, there's some philosophical elements interspersed. And sometimes people, they hear the description, oh, it's a blue screen. Well, that doesn't sound very interesting. It's kind of remarkable to listen to it while you're watching this blue screen. I imagine just listening to it on its own might be interesting, but there's something about the way the blue screen works with the audio track that makes it really unlike any other film that anyone's ever seen. And we're getting to show it on 35 millimeters, so it's going to look right, unlike VHS, which has all this video noise that comes in and the color wavers and it kind of looks like crap.
So it literally is just a single shade of blue for the entirety of the film.
For the whole film. Yeah, I think there's a credits at the end, but
interesting.
Yeah.
And that's the thing, I watched a lot of the experimental films last semester. I've never been a fan of experimental film. I like narrative feature, I like documentary. I've never been able to get into to these kinds of films. But what I found last semester, a lot of these films that I was watching them, they kind of put you in a trance. It's almost like the experience of watching them isn't just about I'm not understanding necessarily what I'm seeing, but it's putting me through an experience. It's the whole experience of watching it rather than just kind of, okay, I know what this character's doing, I know what that character's doing. It's just kind of like the experience. And that's what this film kind of sounds like. It's like, how do you say something about what you're experiencing through film? Can you make someone in the audience feel what I'm feeling? And I think that sounds really interesting.
Yeah, I mean, I hope you see it. I hope a lot of people see it. I will say it can be emotionally devastating because there are some very sort of intense, depressive passages, as you might imagine. But it's not just like some kind of woe is me thing, and it's not just some harrowing, tragic account. There's a lot of complexity to the way it's put together and to all the different things that are included.
Yeah, and so that's Friday, September 28th at 9:30, and the shorts are Friday, September 28th at 6:30. So that's coming up at the end, right after this episode airs. So get your tickets right away. And then coming up on November 9th, the Truly Filmic Shorts program, and this is various directors, but one of them is Shirley Clark, and I know we're doing a Shirley Clark series. I'm guessing
Correct.
This is tied in with that.
Yeah, that was why that one. I mean, that one. It's a great film in its own right, but in thinking about another film to add to this set of films, it made sense to pick one of her early experimental shorts.
Yeah.
This is a series that Joan Hawkins, our faculty advisor, thought up. Thinking about the fact that theaters are so, and the industry in general is transitioning to digital video in a pretty thoroughgoing way at this point, and not as some kind of nostalgia for film or celluloid purism, but rather as a way to kind of highlight the things that film can do, or the ways that film as a medium might affect us, or the way that film as a medium might work, that video still can't do as valuable as digital video can be. So it's not necessarily trying to posit a superiority of film, simply a difference of film. And so there are 4 films that don't necessarily have a ton in common beyond the fact that they have a certain filmic peculiarity to them. The first one is Shirley Clarke's Bridges Go Round, which she put together from early in her career. Shirley Clarke was a documentarian and did a few commissioned films, government commissioned films. And this was put together from some footage she shot of bridges around New York City that didn't end up getting used in a film. And it's just kind of a kaleidoscopic image of bridges. There's a lot of superimposition of different bridges. One interesting thing about the film is that she had 2 different soundtracks made for it. One by the jazz musician and producer Teo Macero, who worked a lot with Miles Davis, and another one by people whose names I don't remember. It's an electronic music soundtrack. Mm-hmm. And so when you see it, you'll see the film with both of those. First with, I think, the Teo Macero one first, and then the electronic one second. And it's the same footage each time. It's only about 3 minutes long each time. And so you get this nice sort of counterpoint, the way these different tracks really affect the way you see the film. The second one there is Nathaniel Dorsey's film Variations. Nathaniel Dorsey is a long-standing filmmaker, avid proponent of film as a medium. Variations is often regarded as his masterpiece, although he has probably lots of masterpieces. It's silent. It's projected at 18 frames per second rather than the conventional 24 frames per second. He calls that sacred speed.
Okay.
Because he likes the way that you can almost see the flicker at 18 frames per second. Okay. He also likes the way the projector sounds. He says a projector at 24 frames per second sounds sort of anxious or antsy to him. And
well, in the IU Cinema, you can't actually hear the projector.
I know.
There are some lower quality theaters out there where you can definitely hear the projector no matter where you are in the theater, but not at the IU Cinema, unfortunately, for this filmmaker.
It is unfortunate. And I've actually projected it in a class, and it was nice because I put the projector out with the students and said, listen.
Well, but the window's open in the projection
booth. They do.
Booth, right?
I guess we could ask Manny if they can open one of the windows specific for that film. They're not hard to take out a window and put it back in.
Yeah.
But Variations is a beautiful film. It's really beautifully taken shots of sort of everyday life kind of stuff. Probably the most famous thing about it is the famous plastic bag stuff in American Beauty. Sure. This is the film where they got that plastic bag from. There's a shot of a plastic bag floating around on a sidewalk in front of a wall in Variations, and the filmmakers in American Beauty saw that and borrowed it. Or stole it, however you want to put it.
Sure.
But it has a certain sense of being sort of just a random set of shots, but he talks in an interesting way about the way it's put together, where he started with a certain shot, one of the shots that he had collected that he wanted to put in the film, and he was sort of playing around with what could go with it, and he realized none of the shots he had could go after it. None of them really made sense after it. So he decided that must be the last shot.
Okay.
And then he found another shot that he decided nothing could go before this. So this must be the first shot. And so he sort of has this very intuitive way of putting the shots together that reveals a lot more about them than just, here's a shot of some guy standing on the street, here's a shot of a bag, here's a shot of a bird or whatever.
Yeah.
And then the other 2 are, I've not seen Janie Geiser's The Fourth Watch. What I know about it, Janie Geiser's a very good filmmaker, but what I know about it is that she reshot footage of people from old films off a video monitor and then matted them into or projected them into her own shot film stuff around, I think, some dollhouse sets.
Okay.
And from what I've read about it, it sort of engages with the way that film and video relate to each other. And it's particularly engages with the way that a lot of experimental filmmakers today are using film and video, not interchangeably, but using both of them and sort of thinking about the differences between them and how each can be used in its own particular ways. And then the last film in that set is Isaac Julian's classic, Looking for Langston, which is a really nice example of the way experimental filmmakers use stock footage. He combines stock footage with staged scenes in this kind of pseudo-documentary exploration of black gay sexuality during the Harlem Renaissance.
Okay. So that's the Truly Filmic Shorts program, Friday, November 9th at 6:30. Most of these are on a Friday evening at 6:30.
I believe they all are, except for Blue is at 9.
Yeah,
9:30,
all the rest of them are at 6:30 on a Friday, but not every Friday. So
right.
Okay, so the other two films here, there's one called Jordan Belson Films Sacred and Profane. Again, I know nothing about this, so...
Okay, Jordan Belson, he died about a year ago. He's a really important guy in the history of experimental film, although throughout his life he wasn't exactly a recluse, but he was kind of a private guy and kept very close control over his work, and so it didn't always get shown as much as maybe it could have. Mm-hmm. He didn't always talk about it as much as maybe he could have, so he's certainly not forgotten amongst experimental film people, but he doesn't get the kind of publicity, or he's not as known as he probably should be. Jordan Belson was a really important figure in the development of the light show, actually, like the 60s psychedelic light show, like laser light shows at planetariums. The kinds of work he made sort of laid the groundwork for those sorts of things. He worked in the 50s alongside some people, names you may not be familiar with, John Whitney and Hy Hirsch, who were also doing these sort of light show kinds of things where they're just using abstract light to create certain kinds of patterns and things. There's a guy named Thomas Wilfred who did these Lumia performances where he would get things that would project light and then put stuff in front of them, or sort of shine the lights on each other and put stuff in front of it in order to create these sort of light patterns on a wall. It's sometimes referred to as visual music. But Belson, his work is unique from the influences particularly of Eastern religions, particularly Buddhism and Hinduism, but also astrology and astronomy and psychology. And he drew from a lot of different sources. But one of the most notable things that shows up in most of his film is the mandala shape, which is a figure from Buddhism and Hindu, a sort of circular figure in which any sort of artistic or visual art created in a sort of circular pattern is sort of what the mandala, or at least for Belson, what mandala meant. And so you'll see a lot of his films, if you see images from them, you'll very often see these sort of circular patterns. And so, to get to this thing about experimental film as a kind of experience, as a kind of adventure in perception, as opposed to this sort of cognition, as opposed to understanding a story, Belson's a great example. It's abstract light shows. Mm-hmm. But it's abstract light shows that aren't just pretty pictures. They have a certain kind of spiritual dimension to them for a lot of viewers. They have a kind of astral dimension to them for a lot of viewers. Mm. It's nice that we're able to show these as well because his estate is still very carefully controlled. And normally when they screen, the woman who's sort of in charge of his estate comes with them and does a presentation. And they were a little bit leery about that not happening, but they sort of okayed it. And so we're going to have really nice 16mm prints of most of these to show.
Very cool. And finally, the last film in here, Friday, December 7th, Art is Ellipsis, The Permanent Revolution. And again, I don't know a lot about this.
I don't actually know a lot about it either, except to say that it is a documentary. I watched the trailer and talked to Natasha Ritzma, is the one who programmed this. Mm-hmm. It's a documentary about, I believe, 4 artists, and particularly their printmaking parts of their artistic practice. There's someone doing lithography, someone who does woodcuts, a couple other printmaking methods. And it's them talking partly about sort of the history of printmaking as a contribution to political activism and political radicalism, but then also for them, their own use of their art, particularly their printmaking, as a kind of political practice, the way that their political practice and political activism and political ideas are affected by art, and the way that you try to use art to affect those ideas in others.
Okay. So this is more of a documentary about experimental...
Yeah, it's not, at least from the trailer, the film itself is not particularly experimental in form, but it's about sort of alternative, radical political uses of art.
All right. Do you have any final thoughts about the series?
I'm pretty happy with this semester's series. Sometimes we put a set of shows together, and everyone kind of looks at it and says, okay, that's fine. But it's not always necessarily the most exciting thing. But this semester, I think, is a particularly good one for us. I'm really excited to see variations in the cinema. I got to say, to those of you listening or watching at home, come to the Truly Filmic Shorts and see variations.
Yeah.
It's a really special experience, and Dorsky does not and will never authorize his films for video release, so you won't get a chance to see it very often.
Yeah, and that's the other thing about these underground films. These are not I highly doubt any of these are on Netflix.
Yeah, I don't think any of these are on Netflix. Some of them are on video, but not all of them. So, it can be difficult to get a hold of a lot of these things.
Yeah. So the Underground Film Series, all semester long. Mark Benedetti, thank you very much. Thank you to all the other programmers of the Underground Film Series who obviously we don't have room for everyone at the table. But again, thank you very much, Mark. We
Thank you,
appreciate
Andy.
it. All right, so we'll get out of here. I'm Andy.
And I'm Jason.
This has been, and always will be, A Place for Film. A Place for Film is recorded at WFIU Studios in Bloomington, Indiana.